Hi, this is Jessica Dunn, and we're going to discuss portfolio risk and return. It is often better to consider the impact that a security has on your portfolio rather than its standalone risk because a well diversified investor is going to care more about that assets implication on their overall portfolio performance rather than their standalone because and their diversification abilities and the correlation that that asset has with the portfolio can greatly reduce the impact of risk to the portfolio than it would if it were a standalone security. So let's consider these following investment alternatives. We have different states of the economy. We have a bust, below average, average, above average, and boom. And the probability of each of these economies happening. So 10% chance of a bust economy, 20% chance that is below average. The important thing here is that the probabilities add up to 100% or 1 because we want to make sure that we're looking at all possible scenarios. In addition to that, we have several different securities here and the returns that we predict given the state of the economy. So, for example, let's look at Alta. In a bust economy, there's a 10% chance of a bust economy, and we expect that Alta will have a 22% return in the event of a bust economy. We expect they have a negative 2% return in a below average economy, a 20% return in an average economy, and so on. So let's consider a two-stock portfolio. Let's assume that we have $50,000 invested in Alta and $50,000 invested in RepoMin. Let's calculate the portfolio return and the portfolio standard deviation. So first we need to talk about the definitions for portfolio return. Portfolio return is the summation of the weight times the expected return of that stock. So if we had a portfolio comprised of 50% Alta and 50% RepoMin in a previous recorded series where we talked about standard deviation and expected return, we had found that the expected return for Alta was 17.4% and the expected return for RepoMin was 1.7%. So let's calculate the return of a portfolio comprised of these two assets. So we need to take the weight of each asset multiplied by its expected return. So this portfolio is 50,000 in Alta and 50,000 in Repo. So together that's a $100,000 portfolio. So if we invest 50,000 of that 100,000 in Alta, that means we've invested 50% of our money in Alta. We can further look at that and say that the remaining 50% is invested in RepoMin. So if we start with Alta, we have 50% of our investment in Alta, and it has an expected return of 17.4%. We have 50% of our money invested in Repo, and it has an expected return of 1.7%. So the expected return of the portfolio then is 9.6%. You can also do it in a different way as well. We could calculate the expected return for each of the assets in the state of the economy. So Alta has a negative 22% return in a bust and Repo a 28% return. If we have 50% of our money in Alta and 50% in Repo, it's going to be calculated as negative 22% times 50% plus 28% times 50% to give us a 3% return. In a below average state of the economy, we could calculate the return expected given that scenario, and it would be 6.4%. 50% times a -2 plus 50% times 14.7%, which gives us a 6.4% return in a below average economy. So we could calculate the returns for each state of the economy, and then we would calculate the expected return of the portfolio the same way we did before. So we would say that the expected return of the portfolio was equal to the summation of the portfolio return in each state of the economy multiplied by the probability of occurrence. So the summation of the return in each state of the economy multiplied by the probability of occurrence. So in a bust economy, we have a 3% return that we foresee, and we multiply it by our 10% chance. Then we add to it our below average return of our portfolio of 6.4%, multiply it by the probability of 20. Add to it the average, which we expect to have 10%, multiply that by our 40% chance, and so on, and you get 9.6%. You get the same answer regardless of method. Doing it this way makes calculating your standard deviation of the portfolio a bit easier. Remember, the standard deviation of your portfolio is the square root of the summation of the return that you foresee. So the portfolio return here minus that expected return squared times the probability of occurrence. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to draw my square root at the end because I don't know how big it's going to be. In a bust state of the economy, we have a 3% return for the portfolio. We subtract from that our expected return of 9.6%, square the difference, and multiply it by the 10% chance of a bust. Add to it the below average, which was 6.4% return minus our expected of 9.6% squared times a 20% chance of occurrence. Add to that our average state of the economy. We expect the 10% if it's average. Subtract from that our expected return of 9.6% squared and multiply it by the 40% chance of occurrence. Add to it our above average return of 12.5% minus our 9.6% expected return squared times a 20% chance of occurrence, plus the boom economy where we have a 15% return. Subtract from that our 9.6% expected return squared and multiply that by 10% chance of occurrence. And then we take the square root of the whole thing. And if you do that, you will get a portfolio standard deviation of 3.3%. So here are the calculations again for both the expected return and the portfolio standard deviation. One thing to note here is that when we were talking about the individual securities, we said that Alta had a return of 17.4% and a standard deviation of 20. Repo had a return of 1.7% and a standard deviation of 13.4. When we combine the two assets, we have a portfolio standard deviation of 3.3%, which is less than the standard deviation of either of these assets in isolation. So by combining these assets, you are able to reduce the portfolio standard deviation below the risk of either of those individual assets in isolation. That's because these two assets are negatively correlated. So when Alta is doing well, Repo is doing poorly. When Repo is doing well, Alta is doing poorly. So they're negatively correlated, so they're canceling out the risk of each other. An asset that's held as a portfolio is less risky than the same asset held in isolation. Most financial assets are held as a part of a portfolio. So two stocks, in theory, there could be a riskless portfolio created if the correlation coefficient is -1. And this is completely achievable. The reason why I said in theory it's achievable is because it's highly unlikely that you're going to find assets that are perfectly negatively correlated, meaning that when one moves up, the other moves down. Now, if you were to get into options, that's completely plausible. But at this point, if we're just trying to find two assets that are perfectly negatively correlated, it would be very difficult to do so. Risk would not be reduced at all if the stocks were perfectly positively correlated. So they had a correlation coefficient of a +1. So the correlation coefficient can range between -1 to +1. So it can take any number in that realm. Usually stocks have a correlation coefficient of about 0.35, so risk is lowered, but it's not completely eliminated. But investors usually hold many stocks. So here, before we talked about the probability distributions, and we said that probability distributions, the more peaked they are, the more concentrated around the mean they are, the less risk there is. And so we see that as we add stocks to our portfolio, that the probability distribution becomes more peaked. So it's less risky. There's a greater chance that you're going to earn what you expect. And so if we were to look at this, if we were to look at the standard deviation versus the market risk here, and we see that as we add stocks to our portfolio, the portfolio risk declines. So with that, we see that there is this imaginary dotted line. And we see that no matter how many stocks we add to our portfolio, it never crosses this imaginary line here, this asymptotic line. This is risk that cannot be eliminated. It is non-diversifiable risk, also known as market risk. Cannot get rid of it no matter how many stocks you have in your portfolio. Now above that invisible dotted line, risk can be reduced. It can be eliminated. If we choose to add assets that aren't perfectly positively correlated or that are negatively correlated, we can eliminate risk by simply adding stocks to our portfolio. Notice that the slope of this line is the steepest at early stages. So it's very, very steep there. You're getting a lot of risk reduction by just having a few stocks in your portfolio. When we get out here, the incremental benefit is less. We're not getting as much benefit through the addition of our 20th stock as we did by adding our second stock because we've already diversified most of the risk. So diversifiable risk is risk that can be eliminated by diversification. It is things that are triggered by random firm-specific events that apply only to specific industries or specific firms. So examples would be a lawsuit, a strike, or a recall. Market risk is non-diversifiable risk. It's risk that cannot be eliminated. It stems from factors that systematically affect most firms, like war, inflation, recession, interest rates. But as more stocks are added, each new stock has a smaller risk-reducing impact on the portfolio. The portfolio standard deviation falls very slowly after about 40 stocks are included. The lower limit for the portfolio standard deviation is about 20%. By forming a well-diversified portfolio, investors can eliminate about half of the risk of owning a single stock. So can an investor holding one stock earn an adequate return given the level of risk? And the answer to that is no. Rational investors will minimize risk by holding portfolios. They bear only market risk, so their prices and returns reflect this lower risk. The one stock investor bears a lot more risk than they ought. So the return is less than that required by the given level of risk.